All right, our next presenter is Arielle Dror. She has been the Director of Data and Analytics at BayFC since 2023. BayFC is one of the 2 expansion sides in NWSL in 2024. Previously, she was a data scientist and machine learning engineer at Zealous. And in BayFC's first season, they made the playoffs. And last year, they set a world record transfer fee, acquiring Rachel Kundananji for $650,000. Of course, that record was broken earlier this week with Germa's transfer to Chelsea. Arielle?
So I just wanted to thank everyone on the organizing committee for having me today. It's really an honor. Today I'm going to talk about BayFC's first year and the lessons we learned in the process. So expansion is not just the lead up to the first game of the season, it's your entire inaugural season, and that's filled with lots of ups and downs, some tears, lots of cheers, hopefully. Every day is really just a little bit different. I also think that some of the lessons I'm going to talk about today are applicable if you ever find yourself in an organization that might be adopting analytics for the first time. This really isn't just applicable if you're going through expansion. But first, I just want to give you a little bit about myself and how I ended up at Bay, though Jen covered actually a lot of it. I went to college at Smith College. It's a historically women's college in Massachusetts. I studied government and statistical and data sciences. I went in thinking I would get a PhD in public policy. Things have obviously changed quite a bit. My senior year, I was in a bunch of my upper level elective courses. They ended up being pretty formative. The first one, I worked with a women's basketball analytics website. It showed me that there was a really big appetite for women's sports analytics that I really just didn't know existed before. Also, fun fact, I had never watched a WNBA game before I did that project, which was pretty wild. And then in my other class, we had to write an R package as our final project. And I worked with a classmate to create NWSL-R, which at the time had one of the richest data sets of NWSL data. And it was really easily usable for R users and eventually Python users as well. Usually you would have to find spreadsheets online, thanks to Jen, or FBref, and then download it. It was really complicated. I posted it on Twitter over my winter break of my senior year. It blew up. My life changed. I ended up meeting a lot of future coworkers from that experience, and I also got to start working with American Soccer Analysis, helping them do NWSL coverage for the first time, which was pretty cool. We were able to use a mix of the NWSR statistics and their new NWSL data and provide a lot of really interesting insights for the first time. And then from there, I joined the soccer group at Zealous Analytics. We were building infrastructure and platforms for our partner teams. At the height, we probably had about 12 full-time people on the team. Fact check. Perfect. But I was one of the first full-time people they brought on board after their initial build, which ended up being really formative for expansion. I learned a lot there. I was also doing public work for women's soccer analytics at the time. So when BayFC came knocking, it was really just a great dream come true. I should say I also found myself in a really lucky situation with Bay. It was really clear that data analytics was going to have a really prominent place in the organization. Our first GM was really analytically inclined, so I knew I would always have an endorsement from someone higher than me, and that was honestly a really big help, especially in the beginning. But going from a team of 12 to a smaller team where I was the only highly technical person who could code was really a really big jump. So now I'm going to jump into those lessons from year one. So first off, this is probably the most obvious. Expansion is an adventure. You're starting from nothing and creating something new. I like to think about it as the most startup of all startups. So I have had the distinction of only working for startups in my career, and I feel like each time I just go earlier and earlier stage. I don't think it's possible to go earlier stage than expansion. So I feel like I've conquered the final boss. So from the first, and I think Bay in particular, we were really challenged more than in a traditional expansion team. We were announced about 6 months before we played before the expansion draft. And my first day of work was 54 days before the expansion draft, which is to say we knew right away we'd be driving the car while it was being built. And the car was also just driving down a highway. And there were no brakes. in the NWSL, just for background, until last year, or until the new teams that are coming in this year, you grew a bulk of your team through an expansion draft. So existing teams could protect a subset of their players, and new teams would be able to select 1 or 2 players from the unprotected players. So that's usually the second half of the roster. But existing teams really do not want to go to draft day for a ton of reasons. They don't want to tell players that they're left unprotected. That really can change a relationship. They don't want to have to leave roster planning till like a month before preseason. So they try and make deals with the expansion teams beforehand, which means from day one, I was pretty much expected to be able to provide player insights because we were actively agreeing to transfers with existing clubs. In fact, we had already signed some players, so that was fun. We had no data pipelines. We had one really great contract with StatsBomb, and that was about it. So it was honestly chaos right away, and it never stopped. We had our first 54 days. We had expansion draft. I think it went pretty well. Then we had our college draft about 3 weeks later. And finally, we began preseason. However, there were some structural changes behind the scenes because nothing is ever static in expansion. So we actually opened up preseason without a single video analyst. And I was tasked with finding the solution because in expansion, you wear many hats, which meant I had to find a substitute analyst. And I was also in charge of ordering supplies, which was my new hat. I became an expert in drones really fast. I can tell you all about DJI now if you're ever curious. But yeah, that's what expansion is. And like I said, we started off with chaos and it never really ended. Here's just a selection of things that happened in the first 6 months. The pitch was not actually ready to use, so we had to spend all of preseason not in San Jose, where we had just moved. Everyone, players and staff. We had our lovely operations team driving to Nike stores, buying shirts and pressing jerseys and T-shirts with our logo while we were at camp. One time we had to run through an airport because we hadn't quite figured out the travel day cadence, almost missed the flight. Just a lot of really crazy stuff. And this is the team we ended up assembling for year one in the data and analytics department. From my previous experience, I think our setup is a little bit unorthodox because performance analysis, like our video scouts or our video analysts, are housed under analytics here, which means that our video and data are actually pretty integrated. It might be more popular or more common on the women's side, but coming from the men's side, I actually hadn't seen a lot of instances like this. But it led to a lot of really tight collaboration that I think was key to our success this year. So AJ, on the tall person, he spent over 5 years with the U.S. women's national team before coming to Bay. He won a World Cup. He's worked with a bunch of different coaches. He has so much experience, which has been invaluable. And then Rachel is our data video analyst, which I think is a pretty funky job title. I should say that we didn't really know what the role would be when we came in, but she basically is an extra hand. So she helps with data. She helps with video with AJ. And it's just a great team. We will never take a good picture together because AJ is 6'4", and I am clearly not. Which brings me to the next point. There are so many tasks that fall under the data and analytics umbrella. This doesn't actually count any of the video tasks. That's a whole different subset of the department. You have the normal things that you're working with, so recruitment, building out your infrastructure, helping your coaches prepare for matches. And then there's things you don't really think about. You have to vet new vendors. Sometimes you're the de facto tech support for all the coaches when their laptops don't work. Anything that touches a computer, you sort of end up having to do. And that's on top of the distraction of a training ground. It's a lot. Your attention is being pulled in 1,000 different directions, and that can be really hard to create good work when you're not able to focus on one task. And if you try to do everything in this web, it could sort of end up looking like this. So in the end, a lot of really important tasks in the first couple of months of expansion fell by the wayside. It was honestly just simply impossible to do everything as a single person. And if you can't get more help, you really need to focus on a limited number of tasks that will allow you to be more successful. So in our case, that meant, this is something I really struggled with in the beginning. I like to think that I got a lot better towards the middle of the season when we had discussions on how we could function better as a team. That was when a lot of our work shifted towards working on match week analysis and, of course, the never-ending task of building out infrastructure. And from then, I think our information that we were able to give to the coaches was actually much better. And next year, or this coming year, the hope is that the shift will focus more on recruitment. And if you ever find yourself working in a small department, which is really common in soccer, my big advice is work with your boss, usually that's your GM, to understand what's important to them, and then work on that. Because after all, you're here to make an impact. But sometimes getting additional hands to help you build out really helps. This is something I was really familiar with from Zealous, because we actually were usually that external set of hands. So I had a lot of experience coming from the other side. And I knew how impactful it could be. And I promise this is not an ad for Source. I know they've come up a lot this morning. But sometimes that type of investment is the best use of, it's the best investment. The people that work in external consultancies, they're not as distracted. They have a wealth of knowledge beyond what you can usually afford at the price point that you would pay to bring in like a data scientist or an engineer. And they also just have more people, so they're able to work on more things. They can work on longer term projects like Ethan mentioned. And then having that information that Source provided, because we ended up working with them, allowed us to give information that we just could not have done in year one, and honestly probably this year as well. Actually, one of the reasons I decided to come to Bay was because there was a commitment to this partnership even before I had decided to come on board. So we ended up working with Source, like I said. It was invaluable. I like to think that we had the data product of like a second or third year team immediately. I joined Zealous right when people started working mostly full-time on the soccer product. And where we were at year one was actually pretty close to where we were when I joined, which was really cool. I also would be remiss if I didn't note that our ownership, Sixth Street, has gotten progressively involved in data and analytics, which has given us some really interesting opportunities. They are able to give us best in practice advice, help us vet vendors. Sometimes it's just like a lot of work to figure out what the best things to do are, especially on the infrastructure side, but they are working with data that's just a much larger scale. So their advice has been invaluable. And there are other ways to find hands, and they don't always cost a lot of money. So using capstone projects at universities is great for projects that you would really love to do, but you don't know what the impact might be, so you don't want to spend a ton of time on them. And it gives a lot of people opportunity to have hands-on experience. Like I said, I did one of those. It was invaluable. Even if you just get a bunch of your peers and share ideas and get an extra perspective from them, that's massive. I know that I actually bounce off ideas from many people in this room. It's just really impossible to build a department with just one set of hands and one brain. So you have to find creative ways to add more thoughts in the room. And these are just some of the ideas that I've had. Next. Just some background before I get into this point. We had a coaching staff this season that honestly had comparatively little professional experience, which meant there was a lot of room for teaching. Just as expansion is a blank slate, in a lot of ways our coaches were also blank slates. And candidly, I had never worked with people who didn't have like some sort of non-data background. Even in my former life as a government consultant, I was still having conversations with people who had some level of statistical literacy. So I knew this was going to be a really big challenge, but luckily we had AJ who had tons of experience doing this, and was really helpful. But it was immediately clear that a weekly touch point where I just come into the office and like give a spiel was not going to cut it. The coaches, were unsure of what they wanted their processes to be like, so I wanted to make sure that we were really involved. They also really, like I said, know nothing about data, so we were trying to figure out how we were going to get through to them. And if you want to have influence, you have to be in the room where it happens. Thank you for a couple chuckles. We were able to work with our GM at the time and other staff to make sure that all of the data analytics department was also in the same room as the coaches. And I think that was probably the most impactful decision we made this year. There's a lot of pros and cons to this. The coaches room is full of a lot of distractions, but it's also full of a lot of information. I know when they would go out to training, I would give a nice deep breath because I would finally get to get work done. So our coaches had a lot of thoughts in their heads, but honestly, they struggled to get some of those thoughts out in a way that was really meaningful for us. So being able to listen to them and how they talked about what they wanted to do was really helpful. And it went both ways. Between the analytics department and our recruitment person, who was like super data heavy, half the folks in the room last year were data focused people who dealt with data every day. So just having conversations that they could hear us have and conversations we had together allowed for like some informal teaching to take place, and it brought us a level of comfort. Of course, we also had formal conversations like match reviews. We emphasized early on that we wanted to keep data as neutral as possible. So early on in the season, there was some conflict regarding some people presenting data to our coaches in a way that made them feel that anything that I did was going to, or even our department did, was going to be used against them. So from the moment on, like, we spent a lot of work emphasizing that data is just merely information, and we're all working together to create a product on the field together, which was really, really helpful. And it really helped towards the end of the season. And we were also able to get a lot of insight in how the coaches best consumed information. So for a while, I was giving them pre- and post-match reports with lots of graphs and visualizations, just the way I like to understand things. And we had repeatedly gone back and forth on these reports. And they were telling what they liked, what they didn't like, how they were interpreting them. But then in August, our head coach basically turned to me. He was like, actually, I don't understand anything you're giving us. And I only understand it if you put video on it, which was really groundbreaking. And it could have been this really devastating observation, but we took it in stride. And we came up with a solution. So I ended up working with AJ to create a sports code window that took a lot of the data that we were always trying to get across to coaches and tie it to video. So every button on here links to video that describes it. So if you were to click on some of those phase progressions at the top, it would show every instance of the phase progression from progression to attack, all the attack sequences, etc., all the chances we created. And we would do this for pre and post match and for all of our opponents. And honestly, it was pretty groundbreaking because we were finally able to speak the same language, which was great. I felt like it was a good instance of we had built enough trust that they were able to say your work makes no sense, and then we worked together to create a solution. And so with all that teaching that had been done, both formally and informally, we really had built a great relationship. And now going into year 2, we're going to be able to build that. And we're also going to turn this into a player-facing product, which I'm really excited about. And finally, and maybe the most important, patience is everything in expansion. There were so many moments this season where we just felt like we were running into a brick wall repeatedly. No progress was being made, but the reality is that progress is incremental until the season is over and you can see where you grew. So we got to the point where I'd call the staff anywhere from data accepting to data enthusiastic. We had our coaches start bringing up data in meetings with our players, and that coincided with that sports code window I talked about. Also, our coaches were dropping bars like this in interviews where they were just casually dropping XG in CBS interviews. And this is a coach who did not know what XG was when we started working together. So we clearly felt like we had gone to a place where we had been trusted. We started really simple, try not to overwhelm them, etc. And that translated on the field too. We had won our first game really luckily, and then it just really went downhill from there. And I remember there was a point in June before the break where we had maybe 10-ish, 11-ish games. We were third to last in expected goal differential. I think we were also third to last in the table. It was really hard to see a way out of it. It was just bleak. But after the break, a lot of our communication had improved. This coincided with that video data alignment I mentioned. And we went on this really wild back of the season run where we ended up clinching playoffs during our last game here in Houston. And our underlying numbers also showed how much improvement we had made too. So we ended up 5th in expected goal differential. Obviously, you could see there's a pretty big gap between the top 4 and everyone else, but that was just sort of how the season shook out. Something that our GM often says is that we're not where we're going, but we're also not where we've been, which is a little cheesy, but I think it actually sums up expansion pretty well. Going into year 2, we feel like we're really positioned to be able to take the lessons we learned in year 1 and move towards what we know we really can be. There were so many moments where we would do something and we think wow, what could we do with more time? And so this off season has been that time that has allowed us to really finally do some super innovative work and move us closer to where we know we can be. And so just to sum up, those lessons we learned in year one, expansion is an absolute adventure, but you just need to roll with the punches. If you make things clear and what you have to do and you keep a small scope, you can maximize your impact. External help is sometimes necessary and it can be your superpower. If you teach informally, that is how you build trust. And above all, you just need to be patient. Thank you.